have you here. We're not for like a donation to WRI when you have another beer. We also have folks on YouTube tonight or on Zoom watching from home. So we have a great crew and a great evening planned for you. The Wenatchee River Institute works towards our mission through our youth and community education programs. Our youth programs deliver hands-on curricula up and down the Wenatchee Valley as far as Brewster, giving experiential learning opportunities to 4th and 5th graders. Today, we had field educators with 5th graders snowshoeing around campus from Wenatchee elementary schools, and they had a great field trip today for youth education. Our community programs are Red Barn events like this, as well as seasonal walks and workshops and a community garden. Recently, we've been snowshoeing here at WRI and at the Leavenworth Fish Hatchery on the weekends. And we've got a lot more Red Barn events lined up. Next week, we have on Wednesday, a story about a black prospector named Antoine Etienne, who mined for gold on Pechaston Creek. And the creek is now named for him. So that would be a cool thing to hear about. Another aspect of WRI is our effort to connect Indigenous peoples to their ancestral lands here. I'd like to take time for our land acknowledgement. I'm going to read it because it is precisely the words that the Shin-Pishquatchu people wanted us to share. This land acknowledgement was created alongside the Shin-Pishquatchu people. We are spreading the message they wish to be spread to the public. The land the Wenatchee River Institute sits on is the ancestral homelands of the Shin-Pishquatchu, the Piscosa or Wenatchee people. The Shin-Pishquatchu, meaning the people in between, had villages positioned along the Wenatchee River and surrounding areas. Their ancestral homeland extends from the Cascade Ridge through what is now known as the Wenatchee and Okanagan Valleys. The culture and economy of the Shin-Pishquatchu people centers on taking care of the land. They fish, hunt, gather roots and berries, basket-making materials, and medicines. The Shin-Pishquatchu are named within the Yakima Treaty of 1855. Language to establish the Wenatchee Reservation was never followed through, even with the needed surveying completed. Many Shin-Pishquatchu now live on the Colville Reservation, 150 miles northeast of Leavenworth. They were forced off their land here, and the U.S. government moved them to this reservation. The Shin-Pishquatchu people are still alive today. They continue to practice their culture, harvest their traditional foods and medicines, and hold their ceremonies passed down from their ancestors. Most people won't see or notice them, but they continue to be on the land they are connected to. Their traditional language is now Inhamshin, which is an interior Salish dialect. We'd like to welcome you all by saying hello in their language. Tilhusht. We offer this land acknowledgement as the first step to amplifying Indigenous voices and recognizing the harm done to them as a people. We stand as an ally to recognize their connection to the land and their rights to practice their culture on these sacred lands. We encourage all to learn about the Indigenous people of the place you now call home. The Wenatchee River Institute is committed to sharing this land acknowledgement and following up with other actions to educate and be respectful. Thank you for that. Another important thing is that we have sponsors. And so I'd like to recognize them because without them, we couldn't do events like this. Icicle Brewing Company. Oh. Gustav's Leavenworth, the Munchin House, Ludwig's, Bavarian Food, North Central Washington Audubon, the Obertal Inn, Anna's Hotel in Pynchon, South, Posey Handpicked Goods, Cove Resort, Kolchuk Consignment, Riverfront Rock Gym, Mitchell Reed and Schmitten Insurance, and the Sleeping Lady Mountain Resort, and finally the Mountain Home Lodge, all contributed to help us do this. And now to introduce our speaker. Dale Swedberg retired in 2016 after 40 years of working for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. His most fulfilling job was managing Sinlahican Wildlife Area in Okanagan County for 16 years, from 1997 to 2013. During his tenure in the Sinlahican, he became acutely aware that he was responsible for managing fire-dependent fish and wildlife habitat that had not seen fire for virtually 100 years. With this newfound awareness, he began studying fire, fire ecology, and fire-dependent ecosystems. Despite doubters, he forged ahead in the effort, giving presentations to numerous organizations, founding the North Central Washington Prescribed Fire Council, co-founding the Washington Prescribed Fire Council, and providing advice and tours to legislatures and state agency representatives. Great, Dale. Take it. It's all yours.
Thank you. Okay. Well, I'm thrilled to be here talking with all of you, and I'm especially thrilled to see so many to come out and listen to my talk. So, thank you very much. And in the vein of the native people who existed here before we came, I'd like to share a quote from an anthropologist whose name was Jay Millers. He was traveling through the Methow Valley in north central Washington with a group of Methow elders, some of whom had not visited the valley for 50 years. About halfway through the valley, one woman started to cry. When my people lived here, we took good care of this land. We burn it over every fall to make it like a park. Now it is a jungle. So the native people by the indigenous knowledge systems or traditional ecological knowledge were designed to keep ecosystems healthy so that people could survive. Okay, we don't share that value, I don't think, where we need to take care of the landscape so we can survive from the landscape. We have other means of being able to survive. Okay, this is I hit something I shouldn't have, huh? And I just like to start with that fire can be an inconvenience, an annoyance, or a disaster, does not diminish its seminal ecological importance and the fact that we depend on it for sustainability and resilience. Okay, so my presentation is going to be about the dependence of our fire-dependent landscape and how we depend on that. So I've got to get used to this. Would you support a land management practice that has been exacerbated by climate change, contributes to unhealthy forests, increases the potential of severe wildfires, interferes with the hydrology of the landscape, contributes to degradation of grasslands, inhibits function and dynamics of ecosystems, and so forth? Would you support that land management practice? Complete unmitigated fire suppression with the goal of fire exclusion is that land management practice. This is going too fast. So how do I stop it or slow it down?
Should be able to just go back. If this is a problem,
Yeah.
you could just come over and hit this.
Okay.
Go forward.
Okay. All right. Okay. Fire exclusion versus fire suppression. Exclusion is the effort to try to, keep fire off the landscape, totally unmitigated fire exclusion. Whereas fire suppression is to suppress fires that are not wanted at that particular time. So we've had 100 years of fire exclusion efforts, and I think you can see the news, especially in the last 5-10 years, of how successful that has been.
Like fire suppression for over 100 years plus climate change, and here's positive proof of climate change, has created a big challenge. Okay, all of these are historic ecological processes, and that's what fire is a historic ecological process. It's been operating in the our environment for about 475 million years since vascular plants or photosynthesizing plants have been a part of the atmosphere because they provide the oxygen and the fuels for fire to burn. And the metrics of these ecological processes, are they biotic? Are they like diseases, parasites, even plants growing out into areas? That's a biological process. Or abiotic, which would be volcanoes, earthquakes, and floods, and so forth. So the magnitude or severity, like of volcanoes, if those happen as often as wildfires did, then we'd have some pretty big problems. But I want to focus on fire. So the metrics, the type, the magnitude, how severe it is, the extent, the frequency, and the timing of the year and the duration, how long these processes occur. A bit of history of fire. It's, as I said, an integral part of ecosystems, has been part of the environment since the appearance of terrestrial plants, photosynthesizing plants. Get this down here. Fire, its effects and its byproducts have contributed to the creation and maintenance of ecosystems for thousands of years, and the diversity of plants and animals. And the ability to use fire, for a long time, I thought was the single unique behavior that separated humans from other animals. And then I found out about these whistling kites, black kites, and brown falcons in Australia, known as firebirds, that will actually pick up a burning branch and drop it someplace to facilitate their ability to hunt and flush out prey species. A prescribed fire is a planned use of fire under prescribed and environmental conditions to meet resource and management objectives. Fire byproducts are products of pyrolysis of plant material, smoke, heat, ash, and charcoal. All four of those play a part in the health of an ecosystem. Fire effects are the outcomes or results from a fire influenced by fire products and environmental conditions during the fire. A fire regime is the patterns of fire on the landscape, the frequency, severity, extent. And then there's 3 types of fire regimes in Washington. We live in an area where ponderosa pine is the dominant forest type in a frequent fire area. And we have mixed severity, which you get into upper elevations where you have Douglas fir and ponderosa pine mix, and that's more characterized by mixed severity fires. And then frequent high severity stand replacing fires that occur in lodgepole pine country. The fire exclusion has greatly impacted the ponderosa pine forests, probably more so than the other areas, although that fire exclusion has had an impact. Why are we fire dependent? There's 90 ecological systems have been identified in Washington. An ecological system represents recurring groups of terrestrial plant communities that are found in similar climatic and physical environments and are influenced by similar dynamic ecological processes such as fire or flooding. And they share similar substrates and or environmental gradients. So of the 90, 53 of those are in north central Washington, 53 of these ecological systems. And of the 53 ecological systems, 16 or 3% are identified as having one of the threats being fire exclusion, fire suppression, or fire regime alteration. And of these 16 systems, 7 are classified as imperiled or critically imperiled, 5 are classed as vulnerable, and 4 are classed as secure. So fire is a very important part of the system that we live in, the environment. Most wildlife habitat depends is fire dependent in this ecosystem. Trees, shrubs, grass, flowers, mosses, all fire dependent. And the nutrient cycle, energy, and water cycles depend on fire. We live in a fire dependent landscape. There's 2 types of fires historically. There's anthropogenic fires started by people, and traditional ecological knowledge, and then wildfire. The zone you can see where the purple is the ponderosa pine areas, and those are frequent fire dependent ecosystems, vegetation zones. The more greenish is the mixed conifer. We live and work in fire dependent ecosystem. And how do we know about the past historic landscape vegetation? Fire scars on trees, scientific studies like sediment cores, fire photos, journals, diaries, reports, oral history. Speaking of diaries, I was reading a diary the other day about a fellow who homesteaded in the Sinlahican wildlife area where I managed for 16 years. And he was leaving to go over on the reservation and do some mining. And so he burned out the area around his homestead so that when in his absence, in case there was a fire, it didn't burn his homestead up. These are fire scarred trees, stumps, and logs. You can see these laps. I don't know how to get this thing to slow down. Each one of those is a fire, and the tree's cambium was killed, and then it begins regrowing. And when a cross section of that is taken, you can see where the fires occurred. There was a fire that killed the cambium in this tree at that point, 1822. And then a dendrochronologist can look at this and determine what years that the fires occurred by looking at this. So there was no fire between 1917 that was recorded by this tree. Now, not all trees record all fires, and not all fires are recorded by any trees. So it depends on how much fuel there is, and perhaps the winds, the environmental conditions at that time that the fire started.
That ponderosa.
Yes, it is. This is another fire scar sample, 412-year-old pine. And the first fire was in 1598, and that's 81 years. So can't explain, why the absence of fire over that length of time. But obviously, the tree did not record a fire. So that doesn't mean there wasn't any fire, just wasn't recorded. Then you look at the subsequent from 1679 all the way to the 1857 or thereabouts. Pretty consistent, the fires. And what that is generally saying, according to the people that have studied this, is that those were anthropogenic fires for the most part, that the natives were burning. If you look at this, this is a fire history study that was done in Frosty Creek. This fire occurred in 1799. This fire occurred in 1800. Notice the area right here that burned in 1799. It did not burn in 1800. So the fires on the landscape are self-regulating. In other words, an area that burned recently is less likely to burn again. I'm going the wrong way here. Yeah, that was the Frosty Creek analysis. Again, there's 30-year interval, well, 60 years. And then 3.2, 2.7, 3.2, 2.9. So randomly, that's high probability that those fires were set by people. Landscape, fire on the landscape, fire scar on the landscape. You can see the area that burned. It converted it from, I call this shrub to steppe vegetation, and now it's the shrubs are reinvading this area. So it's becoming a shrub steppe now. What happened? This is a sediment core that was taken on a lake on the Senlahican, and it's just one of the cores. There was 27 feet of mud, as they call it, that were gathered in this core effort, and this is the tephra from, I believe, Glacier Peak eruption. So the professor at Central Washington University that took this coring has done this all over the Northwest and documented the charcoal in the strata of the cores, and she has been able to determine whether it's grass charcoal or wood charcoal, and also she's looking at the pollen in these samples as well to determine what the vegetation was on the landscape. And so you can get a rough, coarse idea of what the historic fires were in an area by looking at the core sample. And comparative photos. It's 1943. You can see the increased density of the trees on the landscape. This is on the Senlahican. This is about a mile south of Loomis. There's a large rock which has not moved, but you can see the vegetation or the trees around there has grown up. And again, this is on the wildlife area, about 1900. And you can see what it is now. This steppe vegetation is mostly grass and a few shrubs. It's almost all solid shrubs now. So that habitat component is basically gone. from that area. So without fire, it's becoming more homogeneous and less diverse, supporting a diversity of wildlife. Historic stand analysis. In 1896, 65 trees per acre. 2009, 305 trees per acre. So things change. And if you use fire appropriately, you can maintain that diversity on the landscape. Journals, diaries, books. These were very informative reading. And if anybody wants a reading list, if they're interested enough, I can provide a reading list if you contact me or contact Chelsea. Okay, there's no substitute for fire byproducts or fire effects. The byproducts, as I mentioned before, charcoal, ash, smoke, and heat. Some fire effects: reduced fuels, rejuvenated vegetation, thin forests, more groundwater, vegetation mosaic. Charcoal, it's the most stable form of carbon. And it absorbs 5 to 7 times its weight in water. And it increases the water holding capacity of the soil. Contributes to soil building, mitigates the effects of allelopathic chemicals. How many people are familiar with diffuse knapweed? It gives off an allelopathic chemical to keep the competition down from native plants. Charcoal mitigates or reduces the effect of the allelopathic chemical that they're giving off. Smoke. These are the same, these seeds that are sprouted here are from the same cohort as the seeds here. These seeds were treated with a smoke solution. So smoke has, it's not just an irritant, an annoyance for us. It does provide an ecological part. In this area, these are actually in Australia. These are plants in Australia. But the plants that we have locally that I know about that are influenced by this chemical and smoke are basin wild rye and bitterbrush. This is after a prescribed burn on the Sinlahican, and you can see the flush. After the fire in the burn where the logs were at. So the ash is
something real quick.
Okay.
It's on transitions accidentally on your PowerPoint. And I'm hoping
that'll stop it. Thank you. Ash. We saw this fawn lying in an ash pile or in a burn pile of ashes on the farm in Ellensburg. And I had seen that before when a friend from Florida was showing, the benefits to wildlife in Florida of fire. And he had this photo of a fawn, a whitetail fawn, laying in a burned area where there's ash. And I don't recall what he said, and that was in 2006, so forgive me for a faulty memory, but is there less chance of ticks, fleas, or mite infection in this ash? Or maybe odor absorbing of the ash in the charcoal? I don't know, but why would this fawn? I mean, there was all this area around there wasn't burned or anything. And there's this pile of ash, of course, with some branches on it that fawn chose to hide there in plain view. And ash, another it's byproduct. You can see the green flush after the burn. And it releases the nutrients and minerals from old dead vegetation. And then the heat scarifies the seeds. This is Ceanothus velutinus, also known as buckbrush, mountain laurel, number of different names, but these are all little seeds that have sprouted as a result of being heated. Things, and this plant is a nitrogen producer, so it's putting nitrogen back into the soil. Another fire effect was top killed. This elderberry tree was, it was probably about a week or 2 weeks after it had been burned that I took that picture. And this is 4 months and a week later, it had grown 10 feet. So there's, the point being is a lot of these plants and the animals that depend on the plants depend on fire. Believe it or not, there was this thing quit working. This is the fire line. This was a prescribed burn. This is a wildfire that came into this area on the Sinlahican. And when I went out to see that, I was just amazed that the fire stopped on this fire line at this point. Top kill of the aspen. All these young aspen are popping up, probably thicker than the original stand. This was in a book called Prescribed Fire in California Wildlands. It's pretty grainy, but the idea being that there was this point right here corresponds with, I believe, this point right here, and then this point corresponds with that point right there. After, I think it was 30 days after the prescribed burn, this was filled with water. And there was a flow of water in this stream as a result of the burn killing vegetation that was sucking up the water or absorbing the water on the landscape. And if an area is burned frequently enough, then the water frivolous, I'll call them water frivolous plants.
I'm going to try one more thing.
Okay.
So it doesn't do that to you.
The water frivolous plants are going to be reduced in population, whereas the water thrifty plants, ponderosa pine, are pretty thrifty with water use, as are a lot of other frequent fire dependent plants. But in the absence of fire, the water frivolous plants, the water that aren't very thrifty, will use a lot of the water that's there that otherwise would be seep into the ground or be surface water flow. Okay, fire byproducts. The fire effect would be reducing density and distribution of insects such as a Douglas fir tussock moth and fleas. Arachnids such as disease-spreading ticks and mites that cause mange in coyotes and other wild animals. And fungi, armillaria, root rot, and diseases associated with wild rodents and plague and hantavirus. This vegetation, unburned vegetation on the landscape that accumulates for, 10s, 20s, 100 years is going to contain, you know, a lot of rodent middens and so forth. So that's where hantavirus and plague exist. Fires used to reduce the encroachment of pines and shrubs into areas that should be a little more diverse, more grasses, and also this butterfly. This is actually a butterfly in Oregon. I don't remember the name of it. It's a blue butterfly. They thought it was extinct, last seen in 1937, but they discovered it and then started working on trying to restore it. But part of the reason that it you know, became so endangered was fire exclusion, fire suppression, and allowing the trees and brush to take over the habitat that it needed to be open. Okay, so that's talking about all of the values of fire and fire effects and the fire byproducts. So now I'm going to talk a bit about prescribed burns and conducting prescribed burns. So before a burn is conducted, there needs to be a fuels analysis to determine, you know, what type of fuel there is, what its arrangement is on the landscape, and the fuel moisture, and then the topography, because the three things that drive a fire are topography, fuels, and weather. So what's the topography you're dealing with? And the weather. So generally you don't want to have a prescribed fire in a rainstorm or when the wind is blowing. And then the burn plan needs to be developed and reviewed and signed. The burn unit layout, the areas chosen, fire lines put around that, and the lines are to hold the fire in place where you're burning. Then the burning unit preparation, you may need to be doing some logging or thinning before the burning, building fire lines, installing hose lays so you've got water around the burn unit, and complete the burn plan. It's a 23-page template with 21 things to be thinking about, 21 elements that you need to consider. And these become legal documents with your burn permit. And you have to meet all the prescriptions and the requirements of the burn plan. And the prescription parameters are fuels, weather, your objectives. One of the objectives could be reinvigorate 50 to 70% of decadent brush in the shrubs, increase browse for big game, reduce density of Douglas fir seedlings by 75 to 90%, reduce fine fuel loading by 80%, and 10 to 100-hour fuels by 50%, create a mosaic of burn on the unit by making less than 80% black. So it's not just a matter of making it black, not a matter of just reducing the fuels. I guess, well, it depends on each landowner, you know, what's their objective. If they want to make it black and reduce the fuels, and that's fine. But what I'm interested in is this diversity. We need to restore the diversity and maintain the diversity on the landscape for the plants and the animals that depend on that diversity. And then risk assessments are all part of the burn plan. Complete a fire behavior analysis. And these are all the elements that go into a burn plan. So it's pretty thorough. It's not just somebody that says, I'm going to go out and I'm going to burn this area and then run out there and start fires. Especially when the plan becomes part of their permit. And if they violate the permit, then they're subject to penalties. So this is a graphic just showing a burn. You have either a wet area, it could be a dozer line, and you start with a small strip of fire, assuming the wind is blowing this way, or actually the wind is blowing this way. Start small line of fire here, and then run it just like that, just strips like that until you have a good black line, and then you can take larger strips. But you have somebody constantly watching the perimeters and patrolling and making sure that the fire's staying in the area it's intended to be. Oh, before you can do the fire, begin the fire, you have to get smoke permit or smoke approval. And that, through the efforts of the Prescribed Fire Council, that is now, you can get a day ahead. When I was managing the Sinlahican, we got smoke approval at about 9 o'clock in the morning of the day that we planned to burn. So you had to have all your resources there ready to go. You're paying people to be present and waiting to get the approval that you can burn, and get smoke approval. And that can get very expensive. So now we can get smoke approval 24 hours in advance. So there's improvement. And the DNR, I must say, is really trying to do a good job compared to what I was dealing with 20 years ago. It was frustrating. Contingency resources notified and available. And then a last check of the burn unit to make sure that there's nothing that's out of place or you're going to have a problem with. Pre-burn briefing with staff and assignments. So everybody knows what they're supposed to do and nobody has any question about what they're supposed to do. And then a go, no-go check review. And then a test burn is conducted. If the test burn is a go, then begin the prescribed burn. And then there's different ignition techniques for burning: lateral firing, strip firing, spot firing. Violence can consist of natural barriers, dozer lines, or wetting down the vegetation, which I personally don't like having big dozer lines, ripping up the soil and inviting a lot of weeds to get established. And then after the ignitions are complete, and let it burn down for a bit, but before people are leaving for the day, have them mop up 50 or 30 to 100 feet into the burn, and then have somebody monitor the fire continually until it's declared out. I had an incident on the Sinlahican where the fire slopped over on 6 acres of DNR ground. We lost, I believe it was 4 sections of 100-foot hose, which is over $100 a piece. And I think there were like 5 sections of toy hose, fittings, and so forth, because it just got burned up when the fire slopped over. And we lost 2 good burn days mopping up the slop over. So my lesson learned from that is you need somebody out there monitoring all night. So we had somebody out monitoring the burns all night, because missing 2 days of burn was that hurt bad. Yeah, this is a site on the Simlahican that I got a grant from the Recreation Conservation Office, and I started treating these areas on the Simlahican. This is pre-logging and thinning. That's after it's been logged. You can see the tops and branches are kind of scattered around on the ground. They're not piled up in big piles. And this is after the logging, and fuels are curing. And you know, there's a snag right here, a snag here. I think there was a small snag. Yeah, one right there. And again, this is fuels are cured a year later. This is after the prescribed burn. Some of the snags disappeared. That one was retained. I believe this turns into a snag. This turns into a snag. So there's a constant change on the landscape with these burns. You're losing snags and you're recruiting snags for the cavity nesting birds. This is in November 2013, after the fire, June of 2015. And the blue bunch wheatgrass seemed to like it, the sumac, and then all these other shrubs and vegetation. But just remember what it looked like that first. And this is what happened when the Okanagan complex came into the burn unit. Not much. And again, this is the prescribed burned area in 2014. This was August of 2015. The Okanagan wildfire came in, hit the fire line, and in places it was able to get across, and just kind of skunked around in here, cleaning up some fuels. We saw that earlier. You can see how it killed a lot of these small pine trees. We don't need that many pine trees. This is another unit that we logged. And we're preparing to prescribe burn. And this is what happens if you are unable to get a treated unit burned before wildfire hits it. All the leaf trees, it killed all the leaf trees, killed all the trees in the back. So I can't say that it would have been different if we hadn't logged it. I mean, it could have been, you know, just as hot. And I know that there's efforts here to try to get prescribed fire on private lands. That's a big challenge we're working on. The BLM, the U.S. Forest Service, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the national parks all have a fire program, and they try to do prescribed burning. The Department of Fish and Wildlife now has a prescribed burn program. The DNR is ramping up with a prescribed burn program. But we need to get prescribed burns on private lands. So liability, there's a concern about liability. There's a certification program for prescribed burn managers that the DNR puts on. If you successfully take that course and conduct a prescribed burn successfully under their supervision, or not supervision, but observation, then you get signed off as a certified prescribed burn manager, and that removes you from criminal and civil liability by state law. But I'm sure that if somebody pushed it and did something really stupid or whatever, that could get litigated. Landowner is going to be concerned about the cost to plan and implement the prescribed burns. So I know there's an effort here to establish a prescribed burn association, which is a group of landowners to bring their resources together and share resources on each other's ground to try to conduct prescribed burns, and share the costs, share resources, whatever they have to offer. Training personnel. There's going to be an opportunity, I believe, in the area with the Cascadia Conservation District for people that are interested in looking at prescribed burning and maybe getting involved. So there'll be opportunities for training in that. Public reception. This is a big one. A lot of people are just, they see the fires on TV. They, of course, the television is not there showing you prescribed fire or something that's not a disaster. They're showing you all of these, areas that have been burned up and houses burned down and people's lives destroyed and so forth. So prescribed fire is not that. And that's not what the impression that people need to have about prescribed fires and how to get more people to understand, what a prescribed fire is. And I know in New Mexico this year that there was I guess the state's largest fire that was caused by a prescribed fire. And one of those prescribed fires was a pile burn, that the fire continued to exist in the pile throughout the winter. And somebody didn't check on it in the spring when they should have. And it took off. And then apparently there was another prescribed burn that got away. So there is the public perception, and then there's also smoke. And that's another big one, because smoke can cause breathing issues for people. There are people that have some very serious respiratory issues. And the Washington Department of Natural Resources is looking at cost share funds through the Forest Health and Joint Chiefs funding. They're reviewing, updating the smoke management plan. I think that's pretty close to being finalized. And they've developed the prescribed burner certification program and addressing costs through cost share and trying to decrease restrictiveness of the smoke management plan and reduce liability. Natural Resource and Conservation Service. They've restored the prescribed burning as a cost share land management practice, but they haven't come up with the program. Every other state in the US, I believe, at least the continental US, has the NRCS is providing funding for prescribed burning, cost share funding. So in Washington, it got shut down. And this cost share funding, if it becomes available, would be available through the EQIP program, if you're familiar with that. The Washington Prescribed Fire Council has been involved in advocating to increase public awareness and benefits of prescribed fire, helping coordinate training exchanges to increase numbers of qualified burners. And historically, that has been involving people that are already qualified. They have red cards and they're qualified firefighters. They're just working on their what they call task books to increase their qualifications and skills, hoping to get that available to private individuals. Then prescribed burn associations. Again, there's a prescribed burn association that's being formed here. And Colin Sternagel is I guess, heading that up with Patrick Haggerty. So they may be reaching out for support, at least advocacy. So here's people wandering around in Yosemite National Park during a prescribed burn. Now, I'd be real concerned if these guys were going this way. So when they're getting the firsthand tour. Now, old bears can be taught new tricks. Removing the option of controlled burning did not stop the burning, just remove the control. So it's a little chart that I made up. So let's ask these questions. Prescribed fire, is the event planned? Yes. Where will the fire occur? It's known. Under wildfire, is it a plan? No. Do you know where it's going to be? No. Do you know when it's going to be? No. Do you know how big it's going to be? No. So if you want, no fire is really not an option. So once you accept that fact, then you can look at this. Which one are you going to choose? And somebody that doesn't support prescribed fire by default must be supporting wildfire. Okay, just real quick overview. Essential for maintaining resilient forests and landscapes, prescribed fire logging, thinning, manage wildfire, fire suppression, and monitoring the results. It's very important if you're going to conduct a prescribed fire that you monitor the results. You just don't burn something and walk away. Are you getting what you want? Maybe you need to burn more frequently, maybe burn less frequently. And then public understanding, acceptance, and support. So I guess that's a presentation. Thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, we have 1 minute. But I'll stay here as long as there's questions and they keep it open.
Right, until we kick you out. So
yes.
People online, so I'm gonna ask for the box real quick. I don't need the whole thing, just the box. And I can bring this to you and you can talk. Okay. Okay. So people at home here too. Sure. You have a few questions on get to those.
Okay, so the Forest Service is conducting the Central Washington Initiative to clear this area by 2032. How are they involved with this kind of process that you just discussed?
Okay, I'm not intimately involved with that or knowledgeable about that, but they would be using a lot of these, I guess, efforts to make it happen.
Yeah, I guess are they coordinating was my real question.
Well, I'm kind of an independent troublemaker, I guess, but I would think, Colin, do you know if the Forest Service, have you just talked with them?
Well, they're really burning only on federal lands.
Right.
So what we have here is a patchwork of a lot of private lands and state lands. And so a PBA, the advantage of that would be you can cross-boundary burn.
Sure,
so
sure.
That's where, and they can't burn on private lands. So
right.
That's the advantage of like a PBA is that you can do this cross-boundary.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, the increased coordination between land management organizations, whether they're private or public, would be, that would be the objective. So, but you have to get everybody on the same page. So, other question? Pete?
So I was listening to a presentation the other day and Susan Pritchard and Paul Hesberg talking about, you know, the changes in fire season because of climate change and other factors. And so basically fire season starting earlier and going longer and sort of encroaching on those traditional burn windows in North Central Washington, you know, April, May, and then October. So how do you think land managers or prescribed burning efforts should take that into account when they're trying to do prescribed burning? If wildfire season is going to be lasting from May through October, when should practitioners try to burn?
Any chance they have. Yeah, I think this fellow that I talked about in Florida, he started out as a Florida park worker, I guess, and worked his way up to be director of Florida State Parks. And he was a huge advocate of prescribed fire. And he said you need to be burning when Mother Nature's burning. So that's, you know, kind of a scary thought, you know, to be setting fires when it's really hot and dry all over. But they do in Florida. So they've gotten to that point. And he also said, he told me that there's 3 things in Florida that don't like fire: ticks, chiggers, and newly imported Yankees. So, but I think that, you know, burning whenever the opportunity is. If you have, you know, your burn plan done, all the boxes checked, and you get smoke approval, and your burn unit is ready to go, there shouldn't be a problem.
But how do you reconcile that with land management agency whose personnel are off fighting fires oftentimes with trying
to have your contingency resources? You have to have your contingency resources.
Yeah.
If you don't have contingency resources, you know, we always had 2 squads within an hour-and-a-half drive when we were doing a prescribed burn, and they had to be there within 2 hours if we called them. So that's just part of the prescribed burn program. If you don't have contingency resources, you don't burn. You know, it's pure and simple. So it's, you have to be prepared.
In the prescribed fires you were doing, it looked like a lot of labor was involved with that. Like, how big were those fires? Like, how many acres were you guys burning, and like how many people were involved?
100 acres. In one season, we burned 1,400 acres. So we had basically a squad of 5 people, and they were building fire line. Of course, we had the logging done by a contractor that came in and cut the trees and did that.
Is the logging an ongoing requirement, or does that become easier when prescribed burns are taking place more frequently?
Well, it depends on what the landowner's objectives are. If you're producing timber, you know, if you want a lot of timber, then you're probably not going to want to burn frequently and reduce the number of trees out there. I'm not sure if that's answering your question.
Oh, I'm thinking more like in a, you know, prevention of large uncontrolled fires, sort of in public lands, more from that perspective, like how much logging is needed. Is it really difficult to do prescribed fires because it's so much thicker now than it would be, quote unquote, naturally?
Well, you have to work at it incrementally. And the logging, you know, based on the landowner's objectives. If, you know, what we did on the Seminal is I wanted to retain these big trees, but I also wanted a cohort of younger trees. But I was managing wildlife habitat. Some people are managing timber. Some people, you know, some agencies are managing for recreation, and there's a whole range of objectives. So it depends on what the management, the landowner is trying to, meet. What are the objectives?
Thanks for this presentation, Dale. 2 questions. One is, you mentioned there was a policy of fire exclusion for a long time.
Yes.
Why was that? What was the rationale for that? Was it the fear that prescribed fires would get out of hand? Was it another narrative that, was the foundation of that? And then secondly, I mean, Leavenworth is vulnerable to wildfire. Is there a way that we could use prescribed fire to reduce our vulnerability to wildfire here? What would you suggest?
Okay. First of all, the fire exclusion policy came about as a result of the 1910 fires that occurred in western Montana, North Idaho, and Washington State. There's a couple of books out about that. One is by Timothy Egan. I think he deals with the politics of the big burn. And then there's another by Stephen Pine called The Year of the Fires. And those are 2 really good books to get an idea about that. But that was when the Forest Service was in its infancy, and they were kind of lost and really didn't have direction or a mission, and that launched them into the mission. So that's when they picked up the no fire program. There was discussion between the I think Gifford Pinchot, and there was another fellow that they had some pretty knockdown, drag out discussions about whether they should do, light burning or Paiute burning was the term. And the discussion ended up in favor of those that didn't want any fire at all. So they built roads, they built lookouts, they put in communication lines, telephone wires, and just did their effort to, put out all fires. And talking with a person who said that he had talked with some real old timers, and back in the day, the firefighters would get on a horse and they'd get a bough of a pine tree or something, and they just drag it along on the fire because the flames were just really short because there were so little fuel. When they just put it out that way, no fires, whether they were good fires or not. And the next question was Leavenworth. Yes. I think that you're going to have to get everybody educated. That's going to be number one. And I believe having somebody come in and look in these, try to determine which areas are most susceptible to a wildfire, and then get these areas and areas where you can really stop a fire and get those areas treated, either logged and prescribed burn or thinned and prescribed burned, and then start working on the other areas. So these are strategically placed locations that, based on what a fire might do, that starts in the area, where it's going to go, that it gives them a good spot that they can, stop it. So it'd have to be a strategic effort.
I'm gonna reach over to the online people real quick.
Can I jump in real quick?
Go for it. I'm gonna hand the mic real quick to you.
There was just a nice segue when you said you were managing wildlife.
Yes.
In the area. That was one of your focuses.
Yes.
And one of your objectives.
Yes.
And from listening briefly to the things that we went over, the benefits, you were talking about the ticks being killed and bugs and mange for the wildlife, and the water retention, the charcoal in the ground and stuff in the water, trees not drinking up the water, that it's actually going in the ground, and rivers, all good things, all really beneficial. My question would be, I assume long-term it's really good for the wildlife.
Yes.
What about the immediate impact of the wildlife when you burn 1,400 acres?
Well, you're not burning it all at once.
Okay.
So it could be devastating for wildlife. I've seen a deer that was caught in a wildfire. It died, obviously. I saw a bighorn sheep that had walked through ashes. It didn't die from the fire directly, but walking through the ashes, and it just burned its feet so badly that it couldn't get around.
Talking about wildfire, though, what about a prescribed burn? Do you?
I've seen
for that?
Yeah, I've seen
just displaced. What happened?
No, I've seen deer walking around, talking with other people. They've seen deer, eating ash. So they're really, it's not like a wildfire. It's pretty tame. And there's after the fire, it's kind of like a kid's book, but it's really informative, called The Charcoal Forest. And it's just a lot of information about wildlife and plants and stuff that benefit from fire.
Okay, thank you.
Right. So I think we kind of answered this question I'd seen earlier a little bit. And it's a 3-part question, but it kind of all goes together. So is there a strategy vision for prescribed and controlled burns on non-Forest Service land within the Leavenworth area? And if so, who is funding it and involved in executing that vision?
I'm going to say yes, there is a seminal effort going on. And Colin and Sternagel and Patrick Hagerty would be the two people to talk to with Cascade Conservation District. And they're trying to get funding and, get people together to get something going.
So my name's Colin Sternagel, and I'm working with Cascadia Conservation District. Oh,
yeah, I got to be back here.
all right. Colin Sternagel, I'm working with on a contract as a contractor for Cascadia Conservation District to do the research and development of a local prescribed burn association. So we're just looking, and the first thing is outreach education, but we are looking to bring prescribed fire to private lands. And that would be with conjunction with the private landowner, all of our local agencies, fire district. And for more information on that, I'll kind of say stay tuned. And the best way to stay tuned is I'll put my email up and you can join our PBA contact list. And we have some stuff that we're trying to plan for this spring, some learn to burns, and continuing giving more information. There's a lot of stuff out there on YouTube that will kind of keep dishing out to folks, but there is an effort here locally, also all around the state, and we're modeling a lot of what we're doing off what they're doing in Northern California. And they're probably about 5 years ahead of us. They have dozens of PBAs already up, burning hundreds of acres every year, in contingency with CAL FIRE and the private landowners and with the tribes. So we're not reinventing anything, or we're not inventing anything. We're just replicating what has already worked. And a lot of that foundation comes from sort of the traditional ecological knowledge and what the tribes were doing before we came and changed things up. So yeah, I'll put my contact info on a board, maybe on a chat. Maybe I can put it in the chat for the Zoom, and folks can reach out and stay tuned.
Are there any other questions for Dale or Colin? Double check online real quick. No more questions. Okay. Thanks for everybody for coming.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much.
Really help us out if you would stack the chairs, and there are little carts around. I'll pull one out. We can put them on top so that staff tomorrow doesn't have to come in and do all of that.
Thank you. Thank you.
I spent last weekend down in Oregon.